Hello, my sober lovelies. Before we dive in, I'm really excited to announce my group coaching program for women is live, and you can join now. So excited for this because let's be real here. Quitting drinking isn't just about saying no to the glass of wine or booze. It's about what comes after. All the fear, the boredom, the late night anxiety, and the stories you've been telling yourself for years. And that's where my Rewired Sober group coaching program for women comes in. It's only $247. I'm being totally transparent on the price. It's for 3 months, and you'll learn how to shift your mindset, build habits that actually stick, and question the core beliefs that have been keeping you stuck, and find healthier ways to deal with that loneliness and that now what feeling. The best part is you don't have to do it alone. We'll have live group coaching sessions weekly, and there'll be a bunch of women walking through it with you. It's not another cookie cutter sobriety program for mommy bloggers. It's neuroscience meets real life, and it's designed for women to help you not just stay sober, but actually feel good living sober. You can join anytime, and I'd love to see you on the inside. So start today, get instant access. The link's in the show notes. Welcome to Rewired Sober, the podcast where we unpack what it really takes to rewire your brain after alcohol. Hi, I'm your host, Kate Vitella, a registered nurse, board certified in mental health and addiction, sober since 2018, and a coach who blends neuroscience, lived experience, and real talk to help women break the shame spiral and rebuild their thinking with tools like journaling, humor, and honest conversation. This isn't surface level sobriety. This is where the healing gets deep, grounded, and unapologetically honest. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Rewired Sober. Today, I'm going to talk about something that has been on my mind for quite a while. ADHD in women and neurodivergence. And I have to admit, I've come to realize I'm a late adopter. I'm the opposite of an early adopter. I didn't give it a lot of thought when it first started surfacing in women's recovery circles, but I can tell you, and you probably hear this too, at least one in your girlfriend group is now reporting they've been newly diagnosed with ADHD, right? Especially in recovery circles. And in the beginning, I was hearing this a lot. I would even joke with my friends, yes, I know everyone has ADHD. I thought it was because we were sort of obsessed with labels and pop psychology reels on TikTok where people spew 20 minutes of mad wisdom, and we weren't really researching stuff very much. Like at the time, I felt like when this first started happening, kids were saying like, everyone's a narcissist, everyone's neurodivergent. I had some of my stepson's teenage friends saying like, oh, I have Tourette's, I have multiple personalities, I'm neurodivergent. And I was like, no, you don't. But there's other factors here, right? And there was also my thoughts about, well, there's dopamine nation and we're all addicted and big pharma. And I was rolling my eyes a lot. Needless to say, over time, it's like a topic I can't ignore. So many women are coming forward and saying, I have a new diagnosis of ADHD. And I started coaching a few years ago, one-on-one, and I was working with clients who were really struggling. And this was not crap they were making up, right? And even in the beginning, I thought, oh, we just need to, habit stack and just teach them to get up a little bit early. And, I thought maybe some of these women were like varsity level procrastinators or something. And then as I started doing my research, I realized, oh, ADHD was mostly researched in little boys. It's no freaking wonder so many women are getting diagnosed later in life. So I'm going to get into this. So women especially are getting missed because, we show more inattentive, internalizing symptoms, right? And that's not a shock. And that's coming from a major review in National Library of Medicine in 2014. I mean, in other words, they're saying women weren't necessarily hyperactive presenting as little boys, young boys, that they were more quietly drowning. And, women were being praised for being, quote, good girls or easygoing or responsible. And the research keeps proving that women have been living for decades with ADHD. In a 2025 study in the Nature Scientific Report, it showed that women who got diagnosed later in life described years, literally, sometimes entire careers, marriages, motherhood, shaped by masking. And they hid it with perfectionism, emotional overload. They went into burnout before anyone connected the dots. So when alcohol slips into the story, adults with ADHD are 1.5 times more likely to develop addiction. And this comes from a 2021 analysis in the Journal of Managed Care and Specialty Pharmacy. So when you combine underdiagnosed ADHD, chronic masking, and cultural pressure to, quote, hold it all together, it's no surprise that so many women, reached for the thing, alcohol, that promised them relief, even when later it eventually took more from them than it gave. So for me, once I started doing the research, it was like, holy shit, this all makes sense. And here's the straight up neuroscience, and not in a fluffy way, right? And I am not here to shame or doom and gloom. This is just what I've come to understand in working with other women, and how the ADHD wiring overlaps with alcohol misuse, and why so many women didn't fucking stand a chance without really understanding this. So, as we've come to know, ADHD is not a willpower problem. It's a neurotransmitter regulation problem, primarily involving lower than level baseline dopamine. And that affects their task initiation, staying motivated, delayed gratification. They have a hard time with delaying gratification. Feeling, quote, reward from boring shit is hard. Following through with shit is hard. And when you talk about then the intersection of norepinephrine, lower levels equal struggling with attention and alertness and mood regulation and stress intolerance. And then when you look at the prefrontal cortex, the CEO, the planner, the decision maker, with ADHD patients, it's sort of underpowered, especially under times of stress. And your nervous system gets dysregulated. An ADHD brain is likely to swing between being overstimulated and understimulated, emotional flooding and shutdown, not because women are being dramatic, because the brain's sort of braking system is glitching. So now you enter big alcohol, right? And this is why the overlap is so massive, is alcohol basically hijacks that exact same system that already was offline in ADHD. So if ADHD is like the woman's coming in already in a dopamine drought, then alcohol's your dopamine flood. And it can feel like, oh my God, this is the answer. Because the both ADHD and the alcohol abuse involve the dopamine reward system. Now, this might be new news to no one but me, right? It took me some time to come to these understandings. When I finally put my pride down and said, I don't know everything. I can't possibly. And I really needed to understand this for my clients. So when I look at my ADHD clients with a lower than dopamine baseline, and maybe even a higher dopamine threshold, right? They need more to feel normal. Alcohol's perfect. It temporarily boosts the dopamine, and the brain is like, oh, yeah, relief. Of course, we know eventually that drops, and then your dopamine levels fall even lower than baseline. So the woman with ADHD feels focused when she's drinking, relaxed, regulated, socially fluid and confident and maybe creative, right? Until she doesn't. And then there's this crash that hits them harder um, because they were already low level dopamine to begin with. Now, their baseline was already low. And I have to say something here. In one of my previous episodes, I talked about people calling themselves alcoholics and throwing around all this pseudoscience. And I was really frustrated by someone saying, I have a low dopamine level. And I thought she meant it as that she was just chronically like that, and that's why she became an alcoholic, and it was all tied in with her alcoholism, and that's why it was frustrating to me. She may have been talking about ADHD. I don't know. Either way, if that's the case, I stand corrected, right? Well, not either way, but if it's an ADHD thing, then yes, you are coming in with lower than dopamine levels. So you can say, you know, I had a dopamine deficiency, or I had one before I was diagnosed, before I got sober, all the things. Anyway, but it always bothers me when I say something and I don't correct myself, right? Because like Brené Brown says, I am not here to be right. I am here to get it right. And I am totally cool with fixing a problem that I created or admitting when I'm wrong, right? And I was wrong when I said that. But both alcohol and ADHD impair your prefrontal cortex, right? With ADHD, your PFC is underpowered, and then alcohol, it's your PFC is sedated, it's inhibited. So you combine them and it's like you turn off the CEO of your brain. And then you give the intern a tequila shot and say, go, good, and you run the show, make good choices. Anyway, and that's a lot of the reason why you'll hear like an ADHD woman saying, once I had one drink, like all the rules went out the window. It wasn't the rules. Their PFC, their prefrontal cortex went offline. Now, some of this overlaps with all of us with drinking, but I imagine with ADHD women, it is worse. Women struggling with ADHD. I personally have not been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, some of these symptoms certainly correlate with my own life. They overlap. Like I experience like a little bit of time blindness when I'm in the middle of a project, or, I have a tendency to get bored fairly easy. Some of these things, I think are inherent to many of us. However, with women struggling with ADHD, it's amplified, right? So when we talk about time blindness, it's sort of like that, I'll do it later. And that's why I thought my clients were varsity level procrastinators. Um, He's like, they were like, oh, it hasn't been that long, or I can do it later. I can do it right before. And alcohol helps that, because it, helps not feel like shit over the procrastination. Alcohol also causes time distortion, and, one glass becomes four. But, both the alcohol and the ADHD are causing such an emotional dysregulation. Um, ADHD emotions are loud, big, and fast, and alcohol numbs all that discomfort and then, of course, amplifies it later. And so we get into the cycle with ADHD. The cycle becomes they feel dysregulated, drink, the next day, feel worse, right? Drink again, repeat. And I don't think that's an addiction character. That's just a neurobiology looping itself. And like I said, both impairing the executive function of the brain and both disrupting the dopamine norepinephrine balance, as I described. Another thing that I have to say, and then this is all I'm going to say about neuroscience before I get into my rant on the patriarchy, but both alcohol and ADHD hijack the brain's default mode network, the DMN. Now, what the hell's that? That's your brain's sort of autopilot. It's the place where your mind wanders into like old stories and habits and fears and familiar patterns when you're not consciously steering your mind. And why does it do this? We've talked about this before. The brain is obsessed with efficiency. It doesn't necessarily care. It doesn't have a moral compass. It wants to be efficient, and it's obsessed with survival. It is not obsessed with doing the quote right thing. The brain does this because it's wired to save energy by running mental loops, and the default mode network recycles those old stories, those old patterns and predictions so that your brain doesn't really have to work as hard to figure out what's happening next. So with ADHD, when we're talking about the default mode network, it's overactive, and you have rumination and self-criticism and intrusive thoughts and this looping feeling of I'm failing at everything. I had a client who was always telling me, I fail at everything. And it's no wonder alcohol quiets that for temporarily, right? And then the default mode network comes back louder, and that leads to all the shame and guilt, right? It all goes back to the shame and guilt. The big takeaway here is that alcohol wasn't so much the root of the problem for the ADHD woman. It was an attempted solution to a brain that has been understimulated, overwhelmed, and misunderstood since childhood. You know, ADHD and alcohol abuse talk about the perfect storm of the dopamine problems, of the emotional regulation, the stress sensitivities, and executive dysfunction. So once I'm able to talk through this with a client, and it just really drops that shame, and it helps self-compassion rise. And I always say, if we know better, we do better. Why do we do better? Because we understand ourselves, we trust ourselves, and our sober journey makes more sense. Now, when I look at the reasons for the late diagnosis, the reasons why women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond are like, oh, I just went to the doctor and I have a quote, new diagnosis of ADHD. Well, it was literally studied on boys. A fucking shocker, right? But I have to admit, when I think of ADHD, I think of like my stepson's at like age 9, or my sister's little boy she's homeschooling because he's 7 and he is hyperactive, right? Even I at first wasn't thinking of my girlfriend who just turned 50. And why did we study it on boys? Well, hello, Big Pharma, and hello, the patriarchy. For years, the classic ADHD profile was, right, hyperactive, disruptive, impulsive, bouncing off the wall little boy who couldn't sit still in a class. Now, we pan over to the little girl in the class. She's quiet. She's daydreaming. Now, she might be hyperactive as well, but she's also probably high achieving, masking it with some people pleasing. A doctor's more likely to look at a female and say, she's fine. She wasn't fine. She was masking her ass off. Why? Girls were trained to compensate, to mask, to overcome. We don't complain, right? And growing up, women are taught, sit up nicely, be polite, be helpful, get good grades, don't be difficult, work twice as hard to prove your worth, right? So your ADHD symptoms in a female don't stand out. They get buried under good girl performance and overachievement and anxiety and quiet suffering. And guess who gets diagnosed with, quote, anxiety instead of ADHD? Every woman ever. Women use strategy, not symptoms, to survive, right? So here's some things little girls learn to cope. Things like color coding everything, taking on more tasks to hide what's falling apart, perfectionism, people pleasing, working harder, not smarter, obsessively organizing, staying up late to finish what their brain avoided all day long. Now, some of these I can even relate to in high school. School was a little difficult for me. I was street smart. I had a lot of emotional intelligence. I did have a difficult time focusing on some of the subjects. So what did I do? Instead of, getting bad grades and failing, quote, I just became Miss Perfect. I was obsessed with getting up early to study for an exam or staying up late the night before. I worked 10 times harder than other people. I stayed after school, I got tutors, I spent hours on the computer. I did a lot of organizing. My bedroom was very organized. I had all these workarounds, right? I learned workarounds as like a 15, 16-year-old girl because I am not gonna show up to school and be someone who's getting bad grades. And I couldn't have ridden off with this idea that, "Oh, she's just hyperactive because she has ADHD." No, that was reserved for the boys in school. They were definitely given that out. And I'm not saying boys don't have that. They do. They absolutely do. But it gets diagnosed, right? It's very common that you see a young boy and it's like, well, I wonder if they're on Ritalin or have their moms taken them in to, they can't even sit still. Quote, young boys can't sit still. Young girls can't sit still either, but they're figuring it the fuck out, right? And people are mistaking them for mature, capable. And it's like, it's just burnout in a headband. And, when I'm talking about women and even young girls using strategy, not symptoms, what I'm talking about is a little bit more of what I was saying. Like when a little boy struggles with ADHD, and adults are going to notice because their behavior is external. It's impulsivity, hyperactivity, disruption. And when a little girl is going to struggle, adults aren't likely to notice as much because the struggle is more internal. It's more masked and managed and hidden and swallowed, stuffed down. I mean, does that sound familiar for adult women, right? The little girl who stuffs it down becomes the woman who stuffs it down. And then masking is a lifelong strategy until, they fucking crack in adulthood, and which is often around the midlife. It's often around other big changes like motherhood. It's often around the time when someone wants to get sober. So when we're looking at all of these strategies that women learn, I cannot even rattle these off without bringing up the fact that if it weren't for the position women are put in the patriarchal structures that we're in, and when you look at the intersection of the complex challenges women struggle with women of color, queer, non-binary, different socioeconomic statuses, the intersection of all of those struggles, when we talk about intersectional feminism, oh my gosh, I mean, there's so much stacked on women, and we really have to look at intersectionally the coping strategies. You know, the perfectionism armor that so many women develop, girls learn it really fast. If I mess up, I get corrected. If I do it perfectly, I get left alone. We learn that in the workplace as well. ADHD girls and women with ADHD, they become hyper responsible. They maybe get really good grades. They really maybe follow all the rules and overachieve. Or maybe they struggle in school. But perfectionism is not personality. It's just a camouflage. It just really hides some of the struggle, the time blindness, the overwhelm. And maybe perfectionism in women doesn't even show up in the cookie cutter format. Maybe it manifests in extreme weight control, disordered eating, obsession with our looks, overperforming and people pleasing around, the male gender and, trying to perfect the image in the male gaze so that you're not, found out as being so difficult. One thing I really see is the people pleasing. And girls are conditioned to be agreeable, to be kind. We are nice, to be emotionally supportive, to be low maintenance, to be helpful. And a young girl with ADHD might compensate by becoming the helper, the peacemaker of the family, the one who doesn't say no, the emotional sponge. That girl that you see that's, quote, too mature for her age. And people pleasing, I've seen this so many times in coaching. not only does it lead to repressed rage, resentment, drinking, it's just executive level dysfunction in a dress, right? I've often said perfectionism is just fear in a fancy dress. Women who aren't taught to prioritize their own needs because they never learned how. Um, we're over preparing to sort of hide under functioning. And the clients I see, inside feel very disorganized, but maybe on the outside look like more put together women. How are they doing this? Notes, obsessive note taking, color coding everything, 8,000 notebooks and journals and schedules, and they memorize and they stay up all night to catch up on stuff. A lot of living off a last minute adrenaline. Women are praised for this grit of like, I stayed up all night, I color coded everything, I have this calendar, you know, and it's like a level of hypervigilance, that we've sort of disguised as a responsibility. And I keep saying ADHD girls. I don't like that term, but it flows easier than saying girls struggling with. Um, but a girl that is neurodivergent, that has the ADHD brain, they're becoming a tiny adult, and they're the kid who helps the teacher, helps parent their siblings. Maybe they clean up after others, because they've learned that if they sense any danger or tension, then they just fix it before it explodes. And now this isn't all of them, but I'm presenting sort of an archetype here so you can see how easy it is for a young girl with ADHD to quickly become the woman with ADHD. My little sister, instead of bouncing off the walls, she was a daydreamer. She would stare out the window. She would make believe. She was a dreamer. She would lose track of conversations, or she would just get lost in her little dress up fantasies and stories. She'd spend hours by herself, sort of like doodling. She did not like overwhelming loud environments. Um, and because they're quiet as adults, she's a very quiet adult, then adults assume that they're fine. But if you look deep within, someone like that's mind is like a carnival with 47 tabs open, and we don't notice. No one is noticing. And this woman is internalizing everything. See, boys have a tendency, and I say have a tendency because I am not saying all, have a tendency to externalize their struggle. Whereas a girl is going to internalize their failure. A girl living with ADHD is going to think, well, maybe I'm just like lazy, or maybe I'm just like, I can't focus, or I'm not good, I'm not smart. So they hide all their problems, and they're going to internalize all these failures, and it's going to lead to a lot of shame and a lot of self doubt. And like I said, a lot of overcompensating. And so what I see is this internalizing from a younger age leads to the classic adult diagnosis, the misdiagnosis of, oh, the woman has anxiety, she has depression, she has burnout. Well, two things can be true. She probably has all that. But the misdiagnosis is they weren't diagnosed with ADHD. It was never even thought of to look into because of so much emotional masking. And so it is no wonder that it is just now getting the attention that it deserves, that women are getting heard. For years, women were melting down at home and masking and hiding. And I think as we've progressed a little tiny bit, as a feminist, sometimes it feels like we've gone backwards, but we have progressed since my grandmother's time in listening to women. um, you know, Doctors are more likely to look deeper into this. And I'm going to get into this in further episodes because I myself do not have an ADHD diagnosis. I'm going to be talking with women who do, who can bring a real life perspective to this, and who can explain how the diagnostic process went and maybe other misdiagnoses they were given over time. But what I see is a lot of just the social camouflage. Girls with ADHD are a bit more socially intuitive, hyper aware. It might be because they're just compensating for impulsivity or, misattunement from the neurological change that we talked about earlier in the episode. And let's face it, girls study other girls' behaviors. We copy social norms. Girls have a tendency to overthink interactions. I know me, I was the biggest chameleon in high school. And even into my 20s, I still have this like power to chameleon myself. I think that's a woman thing. Um, you know, Building an identity around who we're with. And it sort of works until adulthood, especially it works until you decide to get sober. Especially it works until midlife when you realize you don't actually know who you are, right? And so, you know, I do have to mention one other thing about reading the room and like women being able to copy social norms. So, mirror neurons, that's another thing I have to bring up with the neuroplasticity. Your mirror neurons are your brain's copy paste system. Their job is to read the room, sense the tone, sense the emotion and the tension of the room, mimic other people's behaviors, right? Learn by watching. Um, and women, especially women with ADHD, they have a tendency to have hyperactive, highly sensitive mirror neuron systems. So, what does this mean? It means they don't just see what others do, they become what others need. And this is one of the ways a woman with ADHD has survived without anyone noticing. And masking of the symptoms is a perfect storm, because girls and women young girls are quickly learning if they're struggling with ADHD. If they get praised or scolded, they know, they know which girl's gonna get praised or scolded. They know what a good girl's gonna do. They know what the adults expect. So they copy it, right? And they build an identity around mirroring. Girls do this. We build an identity around social cues, emotional cues, tone cues, performance. And it's not because girls are trying to be fake. It's just like their brain is literally wired to attune and adapt. And this might explain why you see girls becoming more of the helper or the polite one, the emotional barometer for the room, because her mirror neurons are just working overtime and her symptoms of ADHD, they sort of disappear under the camouflage. So when that mask, the good girl mask, meets big alcohol, when those young girls become women and alcohol enters the chat, okay, alcohol's your stress relief. It's your dopamine boost. It's your emotional regulator. I could list a million things that superpowers we've given alcohol, right? Social lubricant, relief from perfection, all the things. Is it any wonder that so many women with ADHD don't even realize they have ADHD or get diagnosed until they get sober? In sobriety, there goes your self-medicating with alcohol and those old strategies falling apart. And it's like the brain starts to reveal itself. Women aren't hiding their ADHD, they're trained to hide it, right? A woman's strategies work until life gets big enough to break the mask. And when is our mask broken big time? Motherhood, midlife, perimenopause, menopause, sobriety, right? And that's when the fucking wheels fall off. And it's no wonder the diagnosis makes sense. because the wheels do fall off in adulthood, in all the areas that I've talked about. And, let's take motherhood for an example. You suddenly, as a woman, have more load, more responsibility. You have zero structure. Your hormones are everywhere. You're sleep deprived, right? You have all the invisible labor. And ADHD finally shows up because your coping strategies stopped working. You know, the cracks widen. This overwhelm hits you hard. And suddenly it's like, oh my God, do I have ADHD or am I losing my mind? Probably both. But it might be worth looking into seeing if you have ADHD because alcohol masks those symptoms. You know, we, all of us women use alcohol for the reasons we've talked about, boredom relief. And even for me, it was like helping me get started on a task sometimes, but especially with ADHD. But when you get sober, God, it becomes so much more clear. Of course, you're going to get diagnosed. It all of this it lends to myself envisioning a woman going to their primary care doctor. Well, and 800 times because you have to beat it into people, unless it's a woman, and saying, "I have all this, right? It's not anxiety. I've already taken the anti-anxiety medications. I quit drinking." And all of this starts to come together and make sense. Suddenly, you have a mid-40s, mid-50s woman with a brand new diagnosis of something we thought was for little boys. And so, it's no wonder so many women are speaking up. And let's talk about midlife a little bit more. I feel like perimenopause blows the cover completely. Menopause, estrogen. Estrogen supports dopamine. Dopamine supports ADHD symptoms. So when your estrogen levels drop, if you have ADHD, it goes fucking feral. Women in their 40s and 50s will suddenly experience like, whoa, more procrastination, more overwhelm, worse memory than before, right? Maybe even emotional lability. Um, and so I see women talk about feeling like they're unraveling. And after a while of the doctor misdiagnosing it as mood swings, then they get the diagnosis. And they get the diagnosis because, your ADHD and your hormones are just playing whack-a-mole, right? Estrogen and dopamine, they're like dance partners. As I said, when your estrogen drops, your dopamine drops. And so in that age of life when perimenopause and menopause hit, those symptoms plus sobriety, all of that feels really hard. Um, and so estrogen here is not just a hormone, it's your neuromodulator. Your estrogen levels directly increase dopamine production as well as the dopamine availability and the receptor sensitivity. So when your estrogen levels are high, like your brain can feel more clear, more motivated, more regulated. But when your estrogen levels fluctuate or drop, then your dopamine tanks. And in perimenopause, it's an estrogen roller coaster. With menopause being the estrogen basement, you know, lower dopamine, you got the brain fog and all the things. So, and it's like, I hear with so many women, it's like, oh, great. Well, my dopamine was already low and now I'm in menopause and I'm in the basement, and I'm digging under the basement. Right. And so I see women fluctuating. I just want to normalize this. Like, during perimenopause, your estrogen's high one day and low the next. And those shifts cause dopamine shifts. And it's no wonder you can feel completely unstable. That's not a word, unstable, instability. And, I'll see a lot of unpredictable emotions. And again, this inconsistent focus. And even sometimes women will say to me, like, I used to be able to handle stuff like this and I can't now. And so, yeah, it can feel like a collapse. So I want to circle back to the training to use our coping skills, the training to mask and hide, and all of that worked in our 20s and even into our 30s as women. But when we get into midlife, it's like that shit stops working because your estrogen levels drop and your dopamine can't compensate anymore. So the masking stops working. It's not like a new ADHD, it's more like an unmasked ADHD. But this also explains maybe cravings for alcohol are higher in midlife because, alcohol artificially boosts dopamine. I've said that a million times. But midlife, your estrogen's dropping. So your dopamine's dropping and you feel less regulated. So alcohol, it's like the best fix. Midlife can be the danger zone for drinking escalation. I see women who will tell me they never drank a whole lot in their 20s and 30s. And then in midlife is when the drinking really started to get amped up. And this can be an explanation why. Obviously, alcohol is not the fix. It's all the things we talk about in the rewired sober container. It's, repattern, reveal, reframe, reclaim. We do that with structure, with consistency, proper nutrition, sleep. Um, in my group coaching container, which is open for all of you women, we will be talking about neurodivergence more going forward because it is my goal to make sure that women feel very seen in this environment. You know, I started with this group about a few months ago, and just in the 3 or 4 months we've been together and doing our weekly coaching, I have covered everything from, the patriarchy to trauma to boredom to, I mean, it, every week we meet and we talk about something else. I think that the women need these containers. They need to be heard because we co-regulate our nervous systems together, right? So some of the reframes that I give my rewired sober group is like, you're not falling apart. Your hormones shifted, your dopamine dropped, your brain needs new support. Okay, so back to ADHD and sobriety. So when you get sober and you stop masking and numbing and martyring, the curtain pulled back, right? Uh, you can finally see how much you are struggling with these symptoms. You can see it's right in front of you, the time blindness, the sensory overload, the task paralysis is right there. It is no wonder that women are getting sober and getting diagnosed. These symptoms were always there. Um, Alcohol just weighed over you like a fucking blanket of chaos. And so if you got nothing else out of this episode besides me rambling on, I want you to take this away. You're not broken or weird or deficient. For years, you've been masking and you're getting sober and you're dealing with this new diagnosis. And the good news is you can rewire, right? And I want to normalize if it took you 30 years to get this diagnosis, it's not your fault. There's no such thing as a new ADHD. Like the other day someone was talking to me and they're like, "Why do all these women have ADHD all of a sudden? Like, is it something about cell phones?" And I was like, "No, it's not cell phones. They've had it for years." And I'm sure cell phones don't make it any more helpful, but it's just one more way that women have been ignored. And I'm sitting here recording this, staring at a bean bag my husband gave me that is the world's nastiest looking. It's a bean bag of Donald Trump, and it's so disgusting. And it's like he's in his nasty underwear staring at me with his orange hair. And I'm going to throw the bean bag across the across the womb. Pun intended. Anyway, I'm going to throw this fucking bean bag, hope it shatters, and keep going. So thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for tuning in to Rewired Sober. You can find me on my Instagram at Rewired Sober, where there are links to catch up with me and all the things I'm working on in my coaching business, or the link tree to my business directly will be in the show notes. I so appreciate you joining me on this journey, and I welcome any feedback or any topics you want to hear about, things that you're struggling with or interested in. I love you all so very much, and I'm just so enjoying doing this with you.